In this video, I'm going to share a feature of AutoCAD that may be helpful to you. Personally, I don't use it very often, but some people do, so I want to make sure that you're aware of it. You'll notice on the application status bar right now that all these buttons are grayed out, which means they're turned off. These features are turned off. Um, in my previous videos, you may have noticed that I had a black background, a solid black background, but you may actually see a grid. And you can turn the grid on and off down here in the application status bar uh, by just simply clicking the button. It'll come on and come off right there. Okay, you can also use the F7 key on your keyboard. So I'm actually pressing the F7 key on my keyboard to turn that on and off right now. Now, if just the grid is turned on, it doesn't actually have an impact on your drawing. Okay, in other words, when I draw a line, it's not going to actually snap to this intersection, for example. It's just kind of an image in the background. Okay. Um, but you can control the settings of the grid. So let's, as we did before, let's right click on the grid and go to settings, the grid button, and go to settings. Um, and you can see right now I have the grid turned on as indicated by the check mark, and also notice the F7 key. That's the quick key on the keyboard that could turn the grid on and off. You can change some settings here. Okay, you could instead of a grid like you see now, you can make it a dotted grid. And you can do some different things there. You can change the spacing. So for example, if I wanted half-inch spacing, I could change this to 0.5 instead of 1, and then select OK, and you can see that the grid changes shape. So let me go back to the settings again. The grid behavior down here, this adaptive grid, means that the grid will basically change its appearance based on your zoom level. So if you want an absolute appearance, in other words, if you want the grid to really be a half-inch spacing by half-inch spacing, you could uncheck adaptive grid and then OK. And that way, when you zoom in and out, you see how tight of a mesh it gets. Whereas if I were if I had adaptive grid turned on, then it kind of readjusts based on the zoom level. Okay, so that's not something. The grid is not something I use very often, but I wanted to share that with you just in case. Also, I'll just talk about this display grid beyond limits later. But you can set drawing limits in in model space, and based on your limits that are currently set in your drawing, you can either display the grid beyond the drawing limits, or you can have the grid confined to the drawing limit. So right now it's displaying infinitely throughout model space because it says display grid beyond limits. But if I were to uncheck this and then select OK, you can see that this is basically the extents of my my drawing limits. Okay, and again, the grid itself is just like an image in the background. It really is just there for your maybe your depth perception if you find that helpful. Okay, now let me turn display grid back on, beyond limits. Okay, and now the next thing I want to talk to you about is snap. Now this is different than the running object snaps that we talked about before. This is just regular snap. Okay, and this is the button on the application status bar down here for snap mode. And again, this is different than object snap. Okay, you can turn it on and off in the application status bar down here, or you can press the F9 key on your keyboard, which I'm doing right now, and turn it on and off. Okay, now you'll notice when I turn it on and off that there is no change in model space at all, that you can't see any kind of change visibly. What you do notice though is that and it may be hard to see on your screen, but my crosshairs are now actually jumping. Okay, it's not a smooth move from one point to the next. It's actually jumping around based on the snap being turned on. Okay, so now the crosshairs are actually wanting to snap to a point on the grid. Now it appears that the crosshairs are actually snapping to the grid that you see, but they actually, the snap and the grid act independently from one another. The reason it appears this way is that if I go into right click on the settings, if I go in to look at the snap mode, notice the snap on, grid on, the snap X spacing and the snap Y spacing has the exact same spacing as the grid that I defined earlier. So this is why I say they act independently. If I were to change the snap spacing to 1, okay, and then go back in here, you can see that now my crosshair is actually jumping 2 spaces rather than 1 as it was before. So these act independently. And when would you use these things? Well, personally, I like to use direct distance input. For example, if I'm drawing a line 5 units, if I wanted to start here, then I would just pull my crosshairs out to the right as we've done in the past, and then type in 5, and that way I get a line that's exactly 5 units, as you can see in the properties palette. I could, however, use the grid, okay, and that would be 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units, 4 units, 5 units. Okay, so there are some uses for grid and snap. Personally, I I like the black the solid black background. I usually don't have the grid turned on, and sometimes I'll have it turned on inadvertently because I don't even really recognize it being there. But if you find that to be a useful drawing tool, grid and snap is there for your use. And that this concludes that video.